Hi, everybody. Excuse me. Welcome to today's version of Sociology 376, Sociology of Religion. So once again, I just want to apologize for doing this as a recording instead of in person. I'm still a little bit under the weather and just not feeling great. So rather than coming in and maybe spreading what I have more than I already did on Wednesday when I probably shouldn't have come in, I'm gonna choose to stay home today and provide you with this recording. Okay, so in this lecture, sort of the plan is to my watch going off. The plan is to finish off talking about um, microsecularization, which is part of Chavez's neo-secularization model, and then look at two other models. So self-limiting secularization from Stark and Bainbridge, and then post-secularization, which is kind of an idea from Jürgen Habermas. After that, we're going to pivot into our first kind of grounded topic, right, where we're looking at a little bit more, moving out of the theoretical, which I know we've spent about half the course looking at just theories of religion and theories of secularization, um, into something a little bit more practical and boots on the ground. So this is our kind of our first case study, and I'll talk about it in a sec.
The last level that we can talk about in terms of neo-secularization theories is micro level. And this is basically at the level of the individual. And basically, when neo-secularization theorists talk about micro level secularization, what they're really concerned about is to what degree does religious belief affect people in their daily lives, how they live, how they choose to act, and these sorts of things. And what they will argue basically is that, you know, we're secularizing in the sense that most people's daily decisions are not affected by religious concerns, right? So I'll just give the example here, like of Roman Catholics, right? Most Roman Catholics, when they are planning out how many children they are going to have, broadly speaking, don't tend to worry too much about what the church has to say on birth control, right? There's going to be a small minority of people who are deeply concerned with what the church has to say about artificial contraception. Most of them, though, and here, the statistics back this up, it's about 90% of Catholic women who are sexually active have used some form of birth control. And so what that suggests at the end of the day is that basically the majority of people don't care that much about religious beliefs and how it affects their daily lives, right? That it doesn't really play a deep role in their decision making, right? So that they might be religious, they might even consider themselves religious, but they're making, their decisions more on secular grounds, maybe on economic grounds than they are necessarily on religious grounds, right? So people will use birth control because they don't want to have 5 children, because they don't think they can afford 5 children, or because the wife or the woman in the relationship wants to have a career, rather than, well, the Catholic Church said in Humanae Vitae in 1965 that birth control is explicitly prohibited and objectively evil. So we see secularization on the level of the individual when people move more from, say, what does my religious kind of authority say, to what do I think, or what is kind of best practices? And I mean, you can make the argument here that, this starts with the Protestant Reformation when people start interpreting the Bible themselves. And that's an interesting kind of argument, I think. And maybe, the roots of secularization broadly are in Christianity itself, which I think, again, is not altogether unfounded and is kind of interesting. But what I think we know is that most people today don't make their decisions based on much in terms of religious considerations. And that's micro level secularization.
Okay, so I'm kind of tacking this on a little bit to neo-secularization, though it really belongs sort of in its own category. But there is this other kind of, I think, relatively minor theory when it comes to secularization that is called the self-limiting theory of secularization. Now, this initially is proposed by Stark and Bainbridge. Again, Stark basically has been kicking around since the 1960s, being a pain in everyone. He's passed away recently, but from like 1960 to like 2020, kicking around being a pain in everyone's butt in sociology of religion, never really taking the sacred cows of the discipline as, as writ, as holy words, as something that needed to be followed. And so he's proposed a lot of different positions, right? No secularization. In this case, the self-limiting theory of secularization. And you can see where this sort of fits in with market theory, right? And I talked a little bit about it when I talked about market theory as well. Basically, right, how this works is Stark and Bainbridge suggest that, basically as forms of religion become established, they sort of become more worldly, right? They shed their otherworldly character. So they become less about spirituality, faith. They become more about things like social welfare and service and taking care of the poor. And, all of those religious impulses may fade over time. And if you want a perfect example of this, right, you can look at the mainline Protestant churches in the United States and Canada, which in a lot of, things like the United Church or the Anglican Church or Episcopal Church in the US, which in a lot of ways have sort of lost a lot of their otherworldly character, right? They become much more about the here and now, and they become less about kind of the spiritual and connecting people with the spiritual, right? So then they start to, according to Stark and Bainbridge, lose their appeal. Why? Well, because according to Stark and Bainbridge, and this is always something that's sort of, for me, rung true. Other people I know disagree, but that what people want out of religion is religion, right? They want spirituality, faith, a connection with the otherworldly, not necessarily, a social welfare organization that runs schools and takes care of the poor. They want a connection with the higher power, and that's what they want. Those other things are secondary aspects of religion, but you need that primary aspect of religion. Okay, so what does this look like, right? Basically, older forms of religion, say the mainline Protestant churches, Roman Catholicism, lose their appeal and people leave, with poor people leaving first, right? For whatever reason, poor people leave at a much earlier rate or a much earlier time than richer people. And I mean, we can talk about this when we talk about the religious landscape too. One of the things that's really happened is the working class. Not that you're super educated. We'll talk about this later. It's strange and interesting. It's the working class and the poor that have left religion in North America and Europe first. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to attend religious services regularly. Okay, it's always the poor and the least educated that leave first, leaving richer people there, and basically it becomes a club for rich people. As membership declines, it provides less social capital, and the whole thing falls into crisis. Now, for Stark and Bainbridge, what happens then is you get a rush of religious innovators who come in and propose new forms of religious life that appeal to kind of the everyday working people, the people who still want that religious experience, but for whom these older forms of religion are no longer working, right? So you get, religious innovators, they propose new forms of religious life. We can talk about, like, say, Pentecostal movements that have done this, and, for the longest time, were fundamentally kind of working class at their core. And then this attracts, once you get religious innovators, then you get imitators, right? New religious movements, sects that come in and basically imitate what's going well and sort of create a groundswell. And according to Stark and Bainbridge, what happens is then you get an increase in religious sentiment. And I mean, there's some pretty good evidence for this. And particularly, I know I talked about it, previously, the Great Revivals, right? Basically, there were periods in the past, right? That famous poem, Dover Beach, where people saw the kind of decline and receding of faith, and then faith kind of came a charging back, right? So like in the 1950s and in the 1990s, we're looking at some of the most religious societies we'd ever seen, right, in terms of the West, right? In terms of regular attendance at religious services. I hit my table, I'm sorry. I'm moving my hands like a crazy person. You can't see because I'm recording myself with no camera on. But yeah, in the 1950s and 1990s, we had a very religious society in lots of ways, right? Lots of people going to church, really strong identification with religion. And so, we've had these sorts of ebbs and flows in religion in the past, like, and going back, as far as like the 18th, 19th centuries, right? And probably even before then, we've always had religious movements. Now, obviously, someone like Steve Bruce is going to say, no, religion is alien, right? That was when everybody shared and kind of knew things like the Bible, right? And Christian stories, or in other parts of the world, right? The Quran or whatever. People don't have that anymore. As there's been, more education, more forms of entertainment, more forms of knowledge, people don't have that as much. And so you won't get that up and down. But this is the theory. Self-limiting secularization says you're going to get a rebirth of religion once religion sort of has a moment of kind of fading from the public scene. Post-secularism, which to my mind, occasionally when I try to read the literature on post-secularism, is something to the equivalent of a migraine, where you hit your head against the wall until your head hurts, because I always find anything with the prefix post to be a little bit brain breaking, but I'll do my best here to sort of explain it. Really, the sort of proposer of an era of post-secularism is a European scholar by the name of Jürgen Habermas. Now, Habermas, is not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination, but what his basic contention is that we essentially have come through the era of secularization, and secularism has essentially won, right? That for all intents and purposes, and for the most part, religion has been pushed out of the public sphere and made something that is almost entirely private, right? That it no longer has the sort of cachet and control over people's lives that it did in the past. It is now almost entirely something that exists only in the private sphere, right? It's been pushed out of the halls of power, right? Religion really, except in a few places in the world, particularly if we're thinking about the West. If you went to the Middle East and India and Africa, totally different story. But in the West especially, we've pushed religion out of the public sphere into the realm of the private, right? It's just you and your God in your house or your church or whatever. Okay, so what Habermas sort of suggests, however, is that this has left a sort of gap, right? Because, and here, with the quote at the top, right, where he says, basically egalitarian universalism, which sprang from the idea of freedom and social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation of the individual, moral conscience, human rights, and democracy, he thinks, is the direct heir of the Judaic ethic of justice. So, right, the idea of justice coming from Judaism and the Christian ethic of love. And basically that these legacies are substantially unchanged, right? Basically that we get the ideas of justice and love from Judaism and Christianity, or I think more properly it would be from Christianity through which flowed Judaism, right? Because Judaism or Christianity essentially started as a Jewish sect, right? So we get, a lot of our ethics, a lot of our understanding of the individual, of rights and all these things from Judaism and Christianity. And, he says, to this day, there's no alternative to it, and that the secular and the humanist have basically held on to these same ideas without really having a source to justify them from, right? And we continue to draw on, in the kind of post-national and post-modern kind of era, we continue to draw on the substance of the Christian and Jewish heritage. There's no alternative to this. And in the end of this quote, everything else is just idle postmodern talk, sometimes translated, and I like the other translation better, but I'm told it's less accurate. Everything else is postmodern gibberish. Okay, so what does this kind of mean? Basically, that the values of secular societies, particularly in the West, are almost entirely drawn from Judaism and Christianity, right? And this is a case that's also made, say, by Tom Holland, who's a historian, in his book Dominion, which is a really interesting book, and I highly recommend it. Not necessarily something we're going to talk about here, but definitely I think worth a read. So, right, basically, what is post-secularism then? It's about trying to having pushed religion out into the private sphere and finding now that, some of the foundations of society in terms of those ethics is a little bit unstable without them, re-inviting religion back in some way that makes sense. And dealing with a couple of things. The fact that religion has not disappeared, right? That, like Stark says, religion ain't going nowhere. And you have to deal with it. And in some ways, you have revivalist faiths that are challenging to enter the public sphere. And how do we invite them in and sort of fold them into the kind of secular order of society, right? So certain forms of Christianity, you might think Pentecostalism being one of these, or Islam, right? Islam has gone through an enormous revival from about the 1980s forward, where Islam, went from, in a lot of cases, a low intensity religion in lots of places to an incredibly high intensity religion, right? Where people are deeply committed to it in ways that potentially they weren't in the past, right? And if you look at accounts of Egypt prior to 1980, right, there was, Egyptian Muslims were in a lot of cases non-observant, right? And as they've encountered modernity, they've had this revivalist moment, which I think speaks to maybe, the self-limiting nature of secularization, perhaps. But post-secularism is really about trying to think through how do we invite religion back into a rationalist dialogue with society, particularly when we have the burden, and I'll say burden, of the Enlightenment, right? That said that religion was entirely irrational and had to be cast out into the darkness. How do we then invite religion back in, right? How do we make religion from which we do get values in ways that I think are fairly undeniable, right? Humanist ethics are this sort of post-World War. I'm being a little bit reductionist there, and I'm sorry. They're really this kind of post-Enlightenment sort of attempt to keep the values of Judaism and Christianity without the religious baggage. But are they sustainable? And so the post-secular is like, can we invite the religious back in and even say that we draw our values from there without necessarily being religious or necessarily bringing it back into the center of society, inviting it back into the discussion of society without, re-inviting it into the power position it once held. All right, so that's where we'll leave it for secularization. And obviously, right, this is going to have a lot of resonance when it comes to questions of youth, because, young people today are living in a principally secular age. And this has affected them deeply because religion now has become sort of one choice amongst many. And particularly when we get to the cultural world of millennials and Gen Z, and then questions of parenting, we're going to see, right, that this reduction of religion to just a part of your identity, whether it is secularization and the death of religion, or, this neo-secularization or post-secularism, religion is now just one piece, right? It's not the full identity that people have. And so how is that going to then speak to how people adopt religion?
Okay, so we are done now. Yay, with kind of the theory part of the course. I know it took a long time. But there's a lot of background to go over when we talk about sociology of religion, just to sort of get the basics. So we're going to look at our first case study here. And this is basically, we're going to go over a good chunk, not entirely all of it, but a good chunk of Rodney Stark's argument in his book, The Rise of Christianity. So this is a great book. This is, I think, an absolute classic of sociology of religion, and a book that very much belongs up there in the canon of what everybody who's interested in this topic should be studying, along with, Durkheim's Elements of Religion, or Elementary Form of Religion, Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Berger's The Sacred Canopy, and I think The Rise of Christianity belongs in that same club. It is that important, and I think it's that good. In a lot of ways, I think it's that revolutionary in the field. So, ostensibly, obviously, this is a book about the rise of Christianity. which I know we talk about Christianity a lot in the course. And again, that's owing in large part to my expertise, which is mostly, having to do with Christianity, but also with the field, right? And the field being a European field interested in its own religious kind of history. So, in looking at this book, there's some really important things going on. The most important thing that's actually going on is this is Rodney Stark describing new religious movements, right? Now he's trying to figure out, from looking at Christianity and looking at some modern parallels, what sociology of religion can tell us about new religious movements, how they emerge, right? And a whole bunch of interesting historical facts. But this really is, as much as anything, a book about how new religious movements begin and grow, right? How new religious movements begin and grow. So yeah, I mean, it's about Christianity, but it's something that we can take, a lot of the things that happen with Christianity from a sociological perspective and use them to understand other new religious movements. And we can take some modern parallels of new religious movements like Mormonism and use them to maybe trace back what was going on with the origins of Christianity. So, really fabulous book. Worth a read for sure if you're interested in the field of sociology of religion. But I'm going to describe to you most of the arguments in the book in quite a detailed way.
So this is the book that we're going to be talking about in this next set of lectures. And basically, the book is one of the most important, I think, in the sociology of religion. A really interesting book that looks back at the rise of Christianity, how it went from this very small, very obscure, very marginal sect of Judaism to become, the dominant religion of the West, in a few centuries, and eventually, on to becoming the dominant religion in the world, only slightly, but the world's biggest religion. And basically, one of the things that Stark wants to test in the book, which I think is really interesting, is whether Christianity's rise in the ancient world, in late antiquity, the end days of the Roman Empire, can be attributed to kind of normal sociological kind of factors and normal sociological processes. And whether this could be compared to something like the rise of Mormonism, um, or whether we need some kind of miraculous, growth of Christianity, something that almost implies a supernatural causation in order to explain Christianity's rise. The book, its methodology is, I think, really interesting. And like we've seen with Stark in the past, he'll cobble together a bunch of historical evidence to do a sort of reconstructive sociology. Now, it's not necessarily the favorite methodology of everybody. And particularly, it doesn't rely necessarily as much on statistics, and it makes a lot of assumptions. It takes a lot of, anecdotal evidence at best, and sort of tries to use it to make the case that it's trying to make. Now, that said, I think it's very, very interesting, and I think it's very, very well done. And Stark is as good at doing this as anybody is. Okay, so he wants to look at the rise of Christianity, and again, he's a revisionist here. So what he wants to do is he wants to test a couple of particular theories and see, whether they're true. So theory one, that basically there had to be some kind of mass conversions, driven by, maybe some kind of supernatural force for Christianity to grow the way it did and become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire within the time frame, basically from the 1st century to the middle of the 4th century. So trying to figure out whether, it can be done by normal processes or whether it needed like huge mass conversions. And so, there's a couple of things to kind of look at here, a couple of historical explanations that he also kind of wants to take a look at. The first one being that the rise of Christianity was just a historical inevitability. That basically, the Roman Empire's kind of religious life was falling apart, and Christianity and Judaism just happened to show up at the perfect moment when a whole bunch of other mystery cults similar to Christianity were emerging, and that, Christianity just happened to win out. But it was a sort of historical inevitability that a religion like Christianity would win out, and it just so happens that Christianity was the lucky one. The other theory was that basically Christianity owes its rise fundamentally to Constantine, to the late Roman emperor, who basically took Christianity from an illegal religion to a permitted one in the beginning part of the 4th century, and then to the official religion of the Roman Empire by the middle part of the 4th century. Constantine, and we'll look at Constantine, in this lecture a little bit. Constantine's a really important historical figure. He is the one, broadly that brings Christianity into the mainstream of Roman life. But Stark's going to want to challenge whether this would have happened anyway and whether Constantine was just kind of jumping on the train or whether it is Constantine that caused the rise of Christianity. All right, so who was Constantine? Well, so Constantine is one of the contenders for power in the Roman Empire towards the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century. So basically, where do Christians kind of sit when Constantine comes on the scene? Because of their unwillingness to pay tribute to Caesar, so basically in the Roman pantheon, the Caesars were the highest gods, and everybody had to basically pay tribute to Caesar, burn a pinch of incense to Caesar in order to kind of be good with that, with the Roman system. Christians refused to do so, like the Jews had refused to do so. One of the things that got the Jews frequently into trouble with the Romans was their unwillingness to, burn that pinch of incense to Caesar, to acknowledge Caesar as a god. So the Christians had long been kind of on the outs in the Roman Empire, seen as a disruptive sect of Judaism, and arguably, though the history is a little unclear, blamed for the Great Fire of Rome under Nero in around the 60s, around 65, 66, where Nero, tried to eradicate Christians in the Roman Empire. So they were subject kind of to sporadic persecution. As it goes, big empires, there would be a persecution of Christians, and then other things would happen. Governors and the emperor himself would sort of lose focus, and the persecution would go away. But Christians were persecuted kind of on and off, in the Roman Empire. Okay, we come to the kind of end of the 3rd century, so, the 290s. The Roman Empire, as it was frequently, was in a sort of leadership crisis. And if you look at Roman history, basically from the beginnings of the empire is more or less constantly roiling through different kind of factions vying for power. This imperial dynasty or this emperor, being killed and replaced by this general. This is going on, with relative frequency in the Roman Empire. At the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century, basically you have 3 factions vying for power. Constantine leading one faction, he inherits basically power from his father, and then he's pitted against 2 other emperors, Maxentius and Licinius. All of these people claim to be the true emperor of the Roman Empire. So this is, one of the many civil wars that roiled the Roman Empire. So one particularly key moment in this particular civil war is what's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And here, Constantine's army faces off against Maxentius, and they are outnumbered 2-1. So, as the story gets told later by Eusebius, who's an early Christian historian, who kind of tacks on with Constantine's entourage and ends up being sort of the official historian of a lot of these things. So basically, as Eusebius tells us, the night before the battle, October 27th, Constantine has a vision where he basically sees that he's told by Jesus to paint these particular Christian symbols on the shields of his armies and they will win the battle. So basically, if he adopts the Christian God, they will get a victory in this battle. And this is, long odds. Now, it's worth noting that in kind of Roman history, being outnumbered 2-1 was not necessarily something that doomed you right off the cuff. There were lots of examples of smaller armies routing larger armies in kind of ancient history, which is probably why Constantine, was willing to face off, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Regardless, they paint all these symbols on their shields, and they win the battle, which is then attributed to the Christian God granting them battle. or granting them victory. So basically, what happens from here? Constantine, becomes very friendly to Christianity in 313. Just about a year after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine, basically orchestrates the passing of what's called the Edict of Milan, which takes Christianity from an illegal religion to a tolerated religion. Still only one religion amongst many. Later on, he will actually be instrumental in elevating Christianity to the official religion of the Roman Empire. He also plays a really key role in early discussions within the now official church of what their beliefs will be. Christianity at this point is riven by a whole bunch of divisions itself between people who believe, either that God or Jesus was God, but only God, and that his kind of semblance of humanity was just an illusion, or that he was only human and that he was elevated to divinity. There's a huge divergence of opinions as to what Jesus actually was. Like, is he one with God? Is he actually, somehow lesser than God, like a God, but lesser than God, created by God? And people are cast out of churches. There's violent conflicts over this between early Christians. And so Constantine, having sort of, brought the church in, and the church becomes a key part of his political power, wants all of these settled. So he convenes one of the early church councils, the Council of Nicaea, and from that we get, some of the definitive statements of Christian belief, the Nicene Creed, which is still used in Christian churches. Like if you go to a Catholic church on a Sunday, you'll probably recite the Nicene Creed. Constantine converts to Christianity only on his deathbed. He's only baptized on his deathbed, which a lot of people have seen as a sort of like cynical play on his part, that he kind of held off. From what I understand, this is actually in line with some of the theology of the time, which said that, baptism washed away all of your sins, and since, and guaranteed you entry into heaven. And since Constantine's a bit of a nasty guy at times, being a Roman emperor, and he'll occasionally have his enemies killed, he sort of wants to save his washing away of all sins and his guaranteed entry into heaven until right at the end, when, there's not a whole lot of chance that he's going to commit any more sins. So he's baptized on his deathbed, and becomes the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. So some historians will actually refer to Constantine as the true founder of Christianity, basically saying that Christianity never would have been anything more than some, backwaters religion from, the Dust Bowl of Judea. It never would have really acquired the status of official religion had it not been for Constantine. And this has been a long historical argument that Christianity only triumphs because they managed to convince Constantine that they are the one true faith. Stark actually takes huge umbrage to this claim. He actually thinks this is entirely wrong, and that Christianity was well on its way to becoming, the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and probably would have done so without any help from Constantine. And Constantine just kind of, reads the tea leaves properly and jumps on that boat. But that ultimately, with or without Constantine, you would have had Christianity, the official, well, maybe not the official religion, but the largest religion of the Roman Empire, by the end of the 4th century, kind of at the latest. So some ways that we can be critical of the book, and some, reasons that we can maybe, be a little bit skeptical of its conclusions. Now, I'll say this, the book has been incredibly well received, and there's not a lot of official commentary, attacking Stark's thesis. I think it's pretty widely accepted that this is a good piece of work in a lot of ways. There's some futzing around the edges, where it's like, oh, he got this kind of his reading of women in this way is a little bit off. Some historical details that historical specialists know a little bit better than him, that I don't know that they undermine his argument as a whole, but there are always critiques and improvements that you can make. That said, some of I think the important critiques and important things to think about when we're looking at his argument here is, he's doing sociology without statistics, right? There's no quantitative data to be gotten out of the Roman Empire. They didn't ask questions about the religion of their citizens. They didn't keep official statistics in the way that we do. And so we don't have access to that. So he's using a lot of anecdotal evidence to make his case, right? In a similar way as the way he'll measure church attendance in the Triumph of Faith, or when you look at his book, Churching of America, 1776 to 2005, there's a lot of kind of slightly speculative reconstructive statistical work that he's doing, which I think tends to work, but it is a little bit speculative, and there's some question as to how much weight we should put to the evidence that he's presenting. The other thing that he does in this book is he'll make deep comparisons to new religious movements that he's studied in the present, particularly the Moonies and Mormonism. And he'll make broad claims about Christianity based on that. Now, obviously, Mormonism and the Moonies emerge out of a very different historical social context than Christianity did. And so I think it's fair to question whether this makes sense. Now, at the end of the day, I think Stark's argument is that, the processes of kind of human bonding are broadly unchanged, right? The way that people acquire their religious beliefs probably hasn't changed that much because it seems to be deeply rooted in kind of human biology and psychology. And depending on how you feel about that claim, you're ultimately going to either like this argument or not. Now, I think for Christians as well, you'll see a lot of Christian apologists use the arguments in this book, to kind of promote Christianity. I don't know that that isn't a mistake at times, because I think at moments there are some things in this book that should make Christians very uncomfortable. And particularly his claims that, the miraculous kind of tales of mass conversions in Jerusalem after Pentecost probably are exaggerated and didn't happen, and either way they wouldn't be required in order to reach the kind of dominance of the Western world that Christianity ultimately achieved. And I think some of these things should make Christians a little bit uncomfortable, because I think he's challenging some Christian history too. So it's a broad revisionism against both secular and I think Christian arguments about how Christianity emerged, which I think is really interesting, and which we will continue in the next video. So one of the early sources we have for stories about Christian growth in the ancient world is really from Christians themselves. We find, stories of mass conversions in the book of Acts. All right, this second part of the kind of Luke Acts book, that we think was written by the same author and sort of follows Jesus in Luke, and then the apostles and what happened after Jesus died in the book of Acts. And then some other historical accounts from Christian historians, and therefore potentially slightly biased historians like Eusebius of Caesarea. So Eusebius, again, is an official kind of historian attached kind of to the Roman Empire. He becomes, the person who sort of tells the story of early Christianity, and in lots of ways, he's considered reliable in some ways, but he is a Christian historian, so he sometimes puts, a Christian spin on things. And this is not uncommon in the ancient world. Revisionist history, in a sense, has a long pedigree. And having, the empire having become Christian, Eusebius then sort of tells a lot of things through that lens. And again, even today, this is not an uncommon thing in history. So we have these accounts, basically of mass conversions in both Acts and in Eusebius's histories. And Stark, basically wants to look at, did we actually need this kind of huge increase in population very suddenly for Christianity to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire? So basically, he takes, again, I think, a novel methodology here. And what he's going to do is basically test, Christianity's growth and try to make estimates about it based on what we know about the history and the rise of other new religious movements. And especially here, he's going to compare Christianity to Mormonism. Now, Stark also has written probably the definitive work on Mormonism, not surprisingly called The Rise of Mormonism. So he knows a lot about kind of Mormonism and Mormon growth rates, and he's going to take that information, he's going to kind of use some assumptions based on what he knows about Mormonism's growth in kind of the late 19th and through the 20th century, and then sort of see if we test a bunch of different ideas about Christian growth rates against what we know about the growth rate of a new religious movement that's on its way to becoming a new world religion. Does Christianity kind of line up with that? Okay, so he starts off by saying that basically we'll sort of make an assumption that we probably have a pretty small group of Christians in the first few months after the crucifixion, 30 to 33 CE. We're probably looking at a group somewhere between 120 and 200 Christians, right? Just the closest, the 12, apostles, and then a very small kind of cohort of other people who had been kind of following Jesus around and were very attracted to his teachings. And that this is probably the core group that we have, starting at that point. Right away, he's going to throw out, basically accounts in Acts 4:4 and Acts 21:20, and these accounts go basically that on the day of Pentecost, right? Tongues of fire came on the apostles. They started speaking in the languages of all the people gathered in Jerusalem, and they preached, the gospel, and 5,000 were converted. So he dismisses this, I think, for a pretty good reason, that, if it had been the case that 5,000 people had instantly converted, this would have, been a good chunk of the sort of resident population of Jerusalem right off the bat. And this would have made more historical waves than we actually have. So he thinks we're probably looking at a much slower growth rate than 5,000 people jumping on board right away. And you can see on the chart that I have here, taken from page 7 of The Rise of Christianity, so by about the year 40, less than a decade after, or roughly a decade to a little bit less than a decade after the crucifixion, he thinks you've probably got about 1,000 Christians throughout the Roman Empire. By the year 100, 7,500, 200, you have 280,000 or 218,000. By the year 300, about 6.3 million, and then by 350, over half the Roman Empire, or about 34 million. And we'll go over how he kind of calculates this, but this is kind of his chart of what he thinks we probably have, and he's doing some reconstruction here as well from historical sources, which we'll cover in a second. Because we don't have official statistics or really any kind of statistics from this period in history, what Stark is basically forced to do is look at anecdotal sources to sort of get a sense of what the Christian population might have been, at different points in its emergence as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. So basically, he kind of starts looking here, middle part of the 3rd century, somewhere around 250 AD or CE. And what he does is he takes writings from both pagan and Christian sources, because we have actually quite a few of these that have survived to the present day, and that we have pretty strong confidence have not been tampered with, or have a minimum of sort of historical or copying errors over time. And basically, kind of looks at these and tries to reconstruct a general portrait of what Christianity might have looked like in terms of numbers at different periods in the development of the Roman Empire. Okay, so basically, looking at the middle part of the 3rd century, he takes people like Origen of Alexandria, who was an early church father, right, one of the prominent early kind of Christian figures in Alexandria. Alexandria had become a center of Christianity, and it was kind of an intellectual and cultural center of the whole Roman Empire in Egypt. And he basically, takes some of his writings and, kind of middle part of the 3rd century, Origen expresses in letters that, essentially Christians still make up a very small portion of the population, both in Alexandria and in the empire. So, probably pretty low, not a huge kind of cultural impact, although we already know at that point that Christians were making a cultural impact, especially in Alexandria, where they had become sort of an important part of the kind of intellectual landscape of the late Roman Empire. Okay, so what Stark says is that 60 years later, even though we know that middle of the 3rd century, Christians were a pretty small part of the population, 60 years later, Constantine basically sees it as politically expedient to adopt Christianity, first as a tolerated religion, then an official religion, and then to become Christian himself. Now, Stark's assumption here is based on a little bit of what you might call realpolitik, right? He's assuming that Constantine was, in a sense, somewhat of a cynical believer, right? That even if he basically believed the message of Christianity, that he probably wouldn't have hitched his wagon to Christianity as a religion if it hadn't been politically expedient to do so. the sort of desire of Constantine to, reclaim power in the Roman Empire and sort of consolidate all power into his own hands, probably overpowered his desire to adopt any particular religion. So what he says is, 60 years after Origen writes his letter saying Christians are a very small part of the Roman Empire, Constantine finds it expedient to adopt it, and presumably because there's enough Christians to form a kind of solid power base for Constantine to draw on. He backs this up too with a bunch of historical accounts, and here there isn't actually much question, as far as I know, on this point, that basically by the beginning part of the 4th century, we have somewhere, estimates vary, but somewhere between 5 and 7.5 million Christians in the Roman Empire, out of a population of 60 to 65 million, meaning that the Christians probably made up somewhere close to about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. So for the first part of the book, and the part we're talking about in this lecture, basically Stark wants to ask, what is the growth rate that you would need to go from that initial number of 120 followers in 30 to 33 CE to 5 to 7.5 million 270 years later, by about 312. And is that realistic? Like, can we realistically expect a religion to grow that quickly? Stark suggests that basically the rate that you need for Christianity to make it from that initial small cohort of 120 followers right after the death of Jesus to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, by 350 is about 40% per decade. So that it's growing at a rate of 40% per decade. So he says, basically any lower than that, right, 30 to 35%, or higher, 50% or above, you end up with either far fewer than what historians think there were, or far more than historians think there were Christians in this particular period. So 40% per decade actually seems to conform really well with sort of the historical estimates, right? If you follow the 40% per decade kind of increase formula, by the middle part of the 3rd century, you still have a relatively small percentage of the population Christian, but by the beginning of the 4th century in 300, you have about 10.5%. Again, see the chart on the side of the slide here. So it fits in terms of the growth rate we need to get the kind of numbers that we're expecting to see to line up with what historians expect are going to be the number of Christians in the world at that point. Now, is it realistic, right? Is it realistic that a religion could grow at about 40% per decade? So Stark again here thinks that it actually is, and he's basing this broadly on his study of the Mormons in the rise of Mormonism. And what he says is that 40% per decade really closely matches the growth rate of Mormons in the last 100 years, right? And Mormonism is a very young new religious movement historically, but it's been growing broadly at, he says, about 43% per decade for the last 100 years. So what he says is, without any kind of supernatural explanation or without being forced by Constantine to, become Christians, you could get basically the right number of Christians by about the year 300 and then 350, then becoming a majority of the citizens of the Roman Empire without really any extraordinary explanation whatsoever. It conforms very well with a kind of normal sociological process.